Okay, have you got me okay? All right. Good morning.
Good morning.
So many of you are in the capstone course. What kind of majors are you in the capstone course?
Agronomy.
Agronomy?
Interior design.
Interior design?
Civil engineering.
Okay.
Econ.
All right. I don't recognize any of your faces as English majors. Nonetheless, I've been involved in teaching this class once before. So I want to talk a little bit about ecocriticism and literary study in a time of environmental crisis. I'm definitely going to refer to your reading for today. I'm definitely going to refer to Aldo Leopold, but I'm also going to mention some other writers along the way whom you may or may not have read at some point in your lives. Probably everybody's read a little bit of Emily Dickinson. I'm going to mention her just briefly. I'm going to mention a novelist, Leslie Marmon Silko, who was a living writer from the desert Southwest. She's a Laguna Puebloan Indian. I'm going to mention John Muir and John Burroughs. I'm going to mention Theodore Roosevelt, who actually was a very highly published author. He's probably the most widely published president that we have in the United States. Who else am I going to mention? Jane Smiley. Has anybody read any novels by Jane Smiley? Contemporary writer. She's got one set in Kansas, actually. She's got one set in Lawrence, Kansas. But that's not the novel I'm going to mention. Anyway, all of these people will show up. Don't panic if you haven't read any of their work. But I'm going to try to just give you enough to make a little bit of sense of what I'm doing with them. So I want to start talking about writing and ideas. And I am an English professor. I'm a writer. I write poetry, I write creative nonfiction, and often when writers show up to give a reading or they appear in a bookstore and there's Q&A, people will ask, where do you get all your ideas? And I think readers and listeners are interested in creativity in the way a particular person standing on the other side of a podium from the people on that side of the podium invent a plot or create a series of images, because ideas have to come from somewhere, don't they? And we like to know a little bit about where they do come from. It can help us examine how we feel about those ideas. So that kind of curiosity fuels one branch of literary study, biographical criticism. The narrative of a literary biography can be a fascinating thing, like one I read years ago about Emily Dickinson. That biography recounted the many family deaths that took place when Emily was a little girl, and the way women relatives so often were the ones who actually cared for the ill or sat up watch with the dying. Emily's mother did this, and sometimes Emily was taken along. The biography went on then to quote some materials that were used in teaching young children to read in 19th century America. And one reading lesson began with a little poem. In the burying ground, I see graves shorter there than I. That's like your first grade reader. The text seems perverse, I think now, as if the point of learning to read was to scare children about death at every turn. Years later, I visited Amherst, Massachusetts to see the historic Dickinson house, and I stood on the second floor and looked at her little desk where she'd written a lot of the poems, 1,600 poems she wrote during her life. And then I picked up a pamphlet with directions to walk over to the first house that was the Dickinson household, where she had been born and lived in her early childhood. And that house has been torn down for a very long time. When I was there in the early 1990s, there was a gas station and a convenience store on the property. But from the lot, as you gazed across, you saw the old burying ground. And on the edge that was closest to the Dickinson household, you saw the Dickinson graves. All of those stones with her name right about at head height. And I thought, a girl might say to herself, well, almost everyone is dead. And then I thought, maybe those countless poems about death weren't such a peculiarity. They weren't a reason to imagine her as an oddball recluse who never left the house and sat around thinking moldy Gothic thoughts. So criticism that has a biographical or a historical perspective places the work in a context of lived human experience. And there have been several other perspectives that have been favored in literary study throughout the 20th and 21st century. And I'm going to give you a slide with some of these, but I suspect you don't need to know any of these. I'm just going to talk a little bit. So biographical criticism I've spoken about. Cultural criticism focuses on historical contexts, but it's especially interested in the way popular culture, like advertising or music or movies or fan fiction, are manifested or influence the literature. Post-colonial criticism explores the way world literatures process a history of colonial domination, as well as the way that colonizing powers depicted and often misrepresented the local cultures that they controlled. Feminist criticism explores literary representations of women and of gender in general, and exposes what critics often find to be stereotyping of characters or perpetuation of unexamined gender roles. Queer theory criticism extends gender studies even farther to focus on sexual and gender identities as they challenge normative expectations. Marxist criticism examines the depiction of economic forces in texts. Formalist criticism looks at text very closely for the way genres are constructed, almost completely ignoring the author or the historical moment in which the work was produced. And deconstructionist criticism emphasizes an indeterminacy of texts because, as post-structuralists have argued throughout the 20th century, language itself is indeterminate. Language cannot adequately grasp the outward world beyond the sphere of language. Okay, that's the stuff that English departments tend to do. And all of those methods of study or theoretical interests keep attention primarily on what's called the human sphere. And that may seem so intuitive that it doesn't even bear a second thought. Alexander Pope, a poet from the 18th century, said famously that the proper study of mankind is man, but some scholars find that very unhelpful and limiting. So, enter ecocriticism. In the mid-1990s, a new field of study was developing, and in the words of Cheryl Glotfelty, it paid attention to the troubling awareness that we have reached the age of environmental limits, a time when consequences of human culture are damaging the planet's basic support systems. She went on to write, and I'm quoting now from an introduction to the very first ecocriticism anthology. She said, if your knowledge of the outside world were limited to what you could infer from the major publications of the literary profession, you would quickly discern that race, class, and gender were the hot topics, but you would never suspect that the Earth's life support systems were under stress. In fact, you might never even know that there was an Earth at all. In contrast, she said, if you were to scan the newspaper headlines, you would learn of oil spills, lead and asbestos poisoning, toxic waste contamination, extinction of species at an unprecedented rate, battles over public land use, protests over nuclear waste dumps, predictions of global warming, acid rain, loss of topsoil, destruction of the tropical rainforest. And I'm going to quit quoting her. But it went on for half a page before she noted wryly that in 1989, Time magazine's Person of the Year award didn't go to a person at all. It went to the endangered Earth, Planet of the Year. So Glotfelty asked, why didn't literary studies take note of the fact that the human realm exists within a much more than human universe, and that our emotional, political, sexual, economic, and aesthetic lives all take place in a material world that not only predates us in deep time, but on which every aspect of our life depends. So for the last quarter century, ecocriticism has been evolving to address those issues. It sometimes goes by other names. You might hear it called green literary studies or environmental criticism. But the prefix eco connects it not just to that which surrounds us, our environs, like environmental, but to the same root word as ecology. You've probably discussed this in this class already, right? Oikos does not mean yogurt. It means home in Greek. And oikos is the root for eco in ecology, in eco-studies. So, bless you, ecology explores the physical world as a home to life. Eco-criticism explores the way literature confronts the concept of world as home. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, eco-critics began to resurrect a canon of nature writing or natural history writing. That kind of work had enjoyed a very large readership in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but it had fallen out of favor, certainly in English departments. So John Muir, how many of you have actually read any John Muir? Anybody? Okay, some of you have. He was a writer of the 19th century who made Yosemite available to readers, much the way Ansel Adams did later through his famous photography. And Muir described Cathedral Peak in Yosemite Valley as a temple displaying nature's best masonry and sermons in stone. Not only did he write about the High Sierra and Yosemite Valley, but he took President Theodore Roosevelt camping in Mariposa Grove to talk to him about the role government could play in preserving disappearing habitats. And indeed, as you know, I'm sure, President Roosevelt really changed the face of our geography by establishing so many national parks and, even more importantly, national wildlife refuges, starting in Florida and then moving elsewhere throughout the continental United States. Another largely forgotten writer was John Burroughs, a widely published columnist about the natural world. And in 1903, he turned his attention as a kind of proto-eco-critic to a scathing critique of what he called sham natural history. About three different writers in particular he was criticizing, Ernest Thompson Seton and William Long, who published tales of woodland creatures that were highly anthropomorphic and which presented as true observations some animal behaviors that were really indefensible from anybody who watches animals and birds. So Burroughs charged that Long's latest book in 1903 reads like that of a man who has never really been to the woods, but who sits in his study and cooks up these yarns from things he has read in Forest and Stream magazine or in other sporting journals. I'm quoting Burroughs now. This is me doing my imitation of a man writing in 1903. Of real observation, there is hardly a vestige in his book. Of deliberate trifling with natural history, there is no end. So what was most obviously inaccurate were observations depicted here on the slide. Long claimed to have made of birds and mammals treating their wounds with sound medical procedures. He said that he had seen muskrats and beavers who had somehow got a contusion, washing it out and applying a little bit of pine tar as an antiseptic. He claimed that he had seen this woodcock creating a little cast and cleverly taking sticks to make a splint. And John Burroughs wrote, "A great many intelligent persons tolerate or encourage fake natural history on the ground that they find it entertaining, that it interests the school children in the wildlife about them. Is the truth, then, without value for its own sake? What would these good people think of a United States school history that took the same liberties with facts that some of our other nature writers do? That, for instance, Washington took his army over the Delaware in balloons or in sleighs on the solid ice with bands playing, or that Lincoln was a victim of the evil eye, or his slayer was portrayed as a self-sacrificing hero, or that they represented the little ship the Monitor on that eventful day on Hampton Roads as diving under the Merrimack and tossing it ashore on its back. Burroughs worked himself up. The nature fakers take just this kind of liberty, he said, with the facts of our natural history. The young reader finds it entertaining, no doubt, but is this sufficient justification? So this controversy reveals a whole set of attitudes toward non-human creatures. To gain our sympathy, they have to be anthropomorphosed. Their primary place in literature is to entertain, and that the ideal is more important than the real. And that was a set of literary values that Burroughs dismissed. And the reason that he dismissed them so energetically was because they were widely affirmed by a reading public. This was not a manufactured controversy. This one was one at the time with the reading public. So some of the eco-critical work early on brought new attention to nonfiction writing, examining what views of nature it either reflected or transformed. Accuracy of observation, truthful reporting, entertainment of readership, inspiration of young people, how to weigh all of these as goals for literature was played out in the public sphere and then became the content for eco-critics. But other eco-critics have borrowed more deeply from philosophers, introducing questions of environmental ethics into a study of texts. And Lawrence Buell was one of the first real theorizers in eco-criticism, and he described what he called an environmental text, a text in which nature isn't just a symbol for human activities or ideas, but is a dynamic process which impacts people and vice versa. And so he writes like an English professor, but here are his four major tenets. First, the non-human environment is present not merely as a framing device, but as a presence that begins to suggest that human history is implicated in natural history. Second, the human interest is not understood to be the only legitimate interest in the book or the poem or the movie or the story. Third, human accountability to the environment is part of the text's ethical orientation. And a text, of course, can have a different orientation from a main character in it, right? You can have an unreliable narrator like Huckleberry Finn and yet have a novel that takes a very strong stand against slavery. That's what we mean by an ethical orientation of a text. Or the third criterion, some sense of the environment as a process rather than as a constant or a given, and that would be at least implicit in the text. The one I want to draw your attention to here is that human accountability to the environment is part of the text's ethical orientation. Does this sound at all to you like Leopold? Maybe a little bit. Buell is definitely drawing on Aldo Leopold, who 50 years before Buell outlined these four tenets, published his famous essay, The Land Ethic, from which you read some freely bootlegged excerpts. So Leopold was the country's first university professor of wildlife management. He taught at the University of Wisconsin. And not only was he a strong researcher, he was a terrific writer. In this famous essay, I think he's acting like an eco-critic 30 years before we even had the term eco-critic. And I'd like to tell you why I think he is one. He starts this essay by examining Homer's famous poem, The Odyssey. When godlike Odysseus returned from the wars in Troy, he hanged all on one rope a dozen slave girls whom he suspected of misbehaving during his absence. This hanging involved no question of propriety. The girls were property. The disposal of property was then, as now, a matter of expediency. not of right and wrong. So we can notice many things about this essay. First, Leopold employs what are called kennings in the beginning of the essay. A kenning is a little term it's been used since pre-literate literatures, a little kind of oral formula like gray-eyed Athena, or rosy-fingered dawn, or the wine-dark sea, or godlike Odysseus. And if you haven't read Homer lately, you might be forgiven for forgetting how many times the sea is said to be wine-dark. It goes on and on. So he's quoting something that said it a great deal in the poem. But here, he isn't just showing us that he can quote or approximate the voice or tone of that ancient poem. Godlike Odysseus points to the protagonist's almost superhuman power. And power is at the heart of the point that Leopold wants to make. Then he shifts his prose into brevity when he discusses expediency. The sentences are short. They are simple. With the syntax, he says, there's nothing more to be said. But of course, for Leopold, there's a lot more to be said. He notes that the ethical behavior was certainly examined in the poem, as seen in the figure of Odysseus's wife, Penelope, who was so faithful, waiting for Odysseus to return. And while we might quibble today about the equity of ethics between husbands and wives in ancient Greece, let's set that aside for just a minute and see what Leopold is up to here. He argues that a land ethic would change the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen from it. That, of course, is the first point of his land ethic, to reduce humanity from a self-appointed godlike position to something mortal. But his next point is something even more radical, to acknowledge not only other animate species, but the non-animate constituents of an ecosystem too. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, animals, or collectively the land. So Leopold's lasting legacy, I like that. Leopold's lasting legacy to environmental studies draws not only on his ability to explore the intricacies of predator-browser population dynamics, the kinds of things he taught at the University of Wisconsin. He also crafts metaphors that powerfully place people within the ecological systems that he studies. How many of you have read his essay, Thinking Like a Mountain? You come across that? Okay, some of you have. When he writes for a wider audience than he would for technical papers regarding the role of grass in controlling erosion, for example, he invites readers to think like a mountain, which is essentially a metaphor. And when he examines the literature of another era, those ancient Greeks that are the foundation for Western culture, he thinks like an eco-critic. What did the poet say, he asks. How did he say it? What did it mean to him or to his audience? What can it mean for us? And those are the kinds of questions that eco-critics ask. Other eco-critics have attended to the question of environmental justice, a perspective that borrows from post-colonial and Marxist studies to examine how marginalized people and marginalized resources so often converge in one place. In the American Southwest, the fraught history of land theft from tribal people, for example, and extractive industries ranging from natural gas to uranium ore and dumping of toxic waste are all explored by the novelist Leslie Marmon Silko in her book Ceremony. So I'm just going to tell you a tiny bit about Ceremony. You didn't have to read this last night, but it's set in the Pueblo, Laguna, and Navajo lands of northwest New Mexico just after World War II. So it's a time when the years of above-ground nuclear testing and uranium mining on native land are really just beginning. Ecocritical examinations of Silko's novel reveal the way traditional Pueblo and Navajo concepts of witchcraft are adapted to explore the 20th century's poisoning of landscape culture and individuals. That is a kind of fallout, if you will, of nuclear bomb construction and testing in the American West. In her book, whole sections of text are set as poetry. And she talks about the way oral traditions, oral stories are knowledge, and knowledge is power, and in fact, storytelling makes things happen. It can heal, and it can injure. Unlike a Western philosophical view that nature is everything is the case, Silko suggests that the universe contains both the natural, which is wholesome, and the unnatural, which is not. We today might speak of background rates of extinction or normal radiation levels, and her characters use a very different and ancient vocabulary. So I'm going to read you just a tiny little excerpt, and imagine this as oral literature. You're not reading it in a book. This is a received tradition. Long time ago, in the beginning, there were no white people in this world. There was nothing European. And this world might have gone on like that, except for one thing, witchery. The world was already complete, even without white people. There was everything, including witchery. Then it happened. These witch people got together. They all got together for a contest, the way we have baseball tournaments nowadays, except this was a contest in dark things. They had Navajo witches there, some from Hopi, a few from Zuni. They were having a witches' conference, that's what it was. Way up in the lava rock hills north of Cañoncito, they got together to fool around in caves with their animal skins. The contest started like that. Then some of them lifted the lids on their big cooking pots, calling the rest of them over to take a look. Dead babies simmering in blood, circles of skull cut away, all the brains sucked out, witch medicine, to dry and grind into powder for new victims. Then this one witch told them all, just listen. What I have is a story. Go ahead and laugh if you want to, but as I tell this story, it will begin to happen. Set in motion now, set in motion by our witchery to work for us. Caves across the ocean, in caves of dark hills, white-skinned people, like the belly of a fish covered in hair. Then they grow away from the earth. Then they grow away from the sun. Then they grow away from the plants and animals. They see no life. When they look, they see only objects. The world is a dead thing for them. The trees and rivers are not alive. The mountains and stones are not alive. The deer and bear are objects. They see no life. They fear. They fear the world. They destroy what they fear. They fear themselves. The wind will blow them across the ocean, thousands of them in giant boats, swarming like larvae out of a crushed anthill. They will carry objects which can shoot death faster than the eye can see. They will kill the things they fear, all the animals. The people will starve. They will poison the water. They will spin the water away, and there will be drought. The people will starve. They will fear what they find. They will kill what they fear. Entire villages will be wiped out. They will slaughter whole tribes. They will take this world from ocean to ocean. They will turn on each other. They will destroy each other. Up here, in these hills, they will find the rocks. Rocks with veins of green and yellow and black. They will lay the final pattern with these rocks. They will lay it across the world and explode everything. So that's Leslie Marmon Silko's exploration of nuclear fear, how the world was changed with the development of the atomic bomb. Let's go to another time. In the early 19th century, the novel Frankenstein was written by Mary Shelley, and today, how many of you have read this in some high school English class? Or here, okay. It's often examined for its expression of uneasiness about science. Is this the way you read it in part, as an allegory for anxiety about science? And about the unintended consequences that can develop from hubris? But eco-critics also see the novel in a geologic or a climatological perspective. They point out that Mary Shelley began writing this novel in 1816, which was the year without a summer, following the eruption of a volcano in Indonesia. She and Percy Shelley spent the summer in the Swiss Alps, where there was terrific snowfall, draping the mountains around them. Storms lashed the countryside, record cold throughout the northern hemisphere. In a letter to her sister, Mary Shelley wrote, "One night we enjoyed and she had enjoyed in scare quotes, "One night we enjoyed a finer storm than I have ever before beheld. The lake was lit up, the pines on the mountain made visible, and all the scene illuminated for an instant, when a pitchy blackness succeeded, and the thunder came in frightful bursts over our heads amid the blackness." And I can almost imagine a quotation of the creature and the storm coming out of Frankenstein, coming from that storm. So record rain, 120 days solid of rain between April and September in Switzerland. It led to flooding, even though the snow pack in the mountains didn't melt. Thousands of Europeans died of hunger, resorting to what one scholar has called eating the most loathsome and unnatural foods, carcasses of dead animals, cattle fodder, leaves of nettles, swine food. Similarly, in New England, there were hard freezes for every single month of the summer. So anxiety about scientific pursuit of knowledge is a well-recognized theme in this novel, but I think we can add to that the terrible sublimity of erratic weather. When the seasons don't respect their own patterns, when they become in a way monstrous also, that's a wild place. And who knows what might happen next. Other eco-critics explore whether wilderness has become a vacation luxury primarily available to affluent white consumers, or whether inhabitations in landscapes and ecosystems also contribute to non-white authors' views of the wild. African-American poet Al Young has spoken of a kind of call and response way of being in the world, drawing on the oratorical tradition of Black churches as a trope for experiencing the self in a larger than human world. The world calls to us, and we call back. That's the world he likes to write about. I love this photograph. I think it's Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger crowning him as Poet Laureate of California, which is just so bizarre. And it's green, of course. Camille Dungy notes that many African American writers explore the historical connections between slaves and the American land. Forcibly dragged from their homeland in Africa, slaves became the labor that transformed a continent that never sheltered them. Today's Black writers, says Dungy, write poems that describe moss, rivers, trees, dirt, caves, dogs, fields, elements of an environment steeped in a legacy of violence, forced labor, torture, and death. So poems that have none of the idealized attitudes toward landscape and rural life that are considered essential to the pastoral tradition should, she says, be considered alongside those from Euro-American perspectives. Anti-pastorals, she says, reflect actual lived experience with the more than human world. While Leopold looked back to ancient Greece for a text to show the antithesis of a land ethic, Dungy says that readers of American literature can look much closer to home. So I sometimes wonder why Jane Smiley's novel, The Greenlanders, hasn't received more attention. She has 2 novels set in Iowa. One of them is called Moo, and it's all about Iowa State University. And when it first came out, I read it, and I thought, no, that's the university I teach in. That's actually Kansas State University. There's one professor who is determined to know hog, and he studies hog. And it's not like pigs or swine, it's just hog as a concept. Another novel that's been much more famously treated as a much more famous text is 1,000 Acres, which is essentially a retelling of Shakespeare's tragedy King Lear, set in Iowa in the age of the factory farm. And if you go and look in some scholarly databases, 1,000 Acres has been the subject of at least 24 scholarly articles. There's not one on the Greenlanders. I like to teach the Greenlanders, even though it's a honking big book. I mean, it's almost 800 pages. It's a fascinating text. It's set at the beginning of the Little Ice Age. And so you can read it thinking about how Norse expansion throughout the northern Atlantic Ocean waxed during a period of warming, essentially of geologic warming. And then came the Little Ice Age with increased cooling, made it much more dangerous for ships to travel. The colonies of Vikings in North America disappeared from the landscape. There had been a thriving colony in Greenland, and it too disappeared from the landscape. This novel is set in that time, and so it follows villagers who are watching the climate change around them, underneath their feet. They don't do a very good job of changing with it. They fail to understand the increased pressure on their agrarian livelihood, and they adapt so poorly to the changing conditions that increased violence and cruelty seem almost inescapable. While the winters get colder, more babies die. The cattle herds dwindle, and the people perceive the best hunter in the settlement as someone odd, kind of wicked. They think maybe he's a witch, and so they execute him. So they've killed their best hunter. Each year, they wait for a ship that they hope will come from the mainland, and it never does. As a reader, I become so frustrated with the characters, I want to slap them, even though I care very much about them. A friend of mine, who was a city planner for years, told me he enjoyed reading that novel because the story reminded him how hard it is for people to change customs and expectations. And it is hard to change customs and expectations in the face of climate change, a fact whose importance crosses all academic disciplines and all societies. So, to sum up a bit, ecocriticism is intrinsically interdisciplinary, drawing not only from social sciences and other humanities, which most literary study does, but from the natural sciences as well. I think it can offer a considered vocabulary to explore and formulate new attitudes and understandings. Aldo Leopold doesn't have to be the last one to make up an interesting term like the land ethic, or to suggest that animals and people are part of the land. Ecocritics actually have to know something about how ecosystems function and whether, in fact, birds make little casts. And specialists in designing or administering systems for sustainability should, I think, consider the way scientific or technical endeavors reflect or challenge all kinds of emotional, philosophical, and ethical concerns. I once heard the journalist Bill Moyers having a conversation with an Iroquois woman elder regarding spiritual and social connection to natural processes and how oratory or narrative can give voice to that connection. And Moyers kept using the term praise, giving praise, which I think comes right out of a Christian tradition. And his conversationalist kept correcting him and saying, no, I don't say praise. I say thanksgiving, thanksgiving. And I think everything resides sometimes in the differences of vocabulary, the calibration of meaning that exists in the way we talk about the more than human world and our relationship to it. Once I had a conversation with a colleague from philosophy, and I actually had a version of that slide up in a lecture I was giving, talking about Buell's tenets of an environmental text. And my colleague said, does he really mean accountability between humans and landscape? And I said, yeah, he really means that. Moral philosophy, he said, no. Moral philosophy is founded on equal accountability. And how could a person hold the environment accountable for violence or injustice done to the individual? Well, I didn't have an answer for that. But I went away and I thought about it long enough that I put it in my lecture today. And I like to think that this kind of interdisciplinary conversation needs to take place not just between philosophers and English professors, but people who read. People who read. A lot of us get our ideas from the worlds we inhabit. And those are real worlds. Our front yard, our town, our continent, our climate. But we also get the ideas from the cultural worlds that we inhabit. Ecocriticism takes count of all of those. And that's basically what I have for you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.